Thank you for coming down tonight. We're gonna get started here. This is What the Health, brought to you by way too many awesome organizations to list right now. When Ezra, Klein, and I first met 6 years ago, we had no idea that there'd be a giant fight for healthcare reform going on right now. We didn't have any idea that Max Baucus, our senator, would be the person writing the bill in Congress, and we didn't know that he would have just been named America's sexiest health policy analyst. But yeah, Max Baucus. Ezra Klein. And so I had the opportunity to bring him out here. This is his first trip to Montana. He's an associate editor now of the American Prospect, one of the most well-known bloggers in the country. He's been a featured guest on MSNBC, CNN, NPR, a number of other locations, been a featured writer in the LA Times. Has a hell of a resume. He is smart, he is good on his feet, and he's here to give us an inside look at what's going on in Washington, D.C. I heard it said recently that journalists expose the truth and activists confront reality. Most of us in this room are activists, and we're here tonight to find out what's going on so that we can help change it for the better. We're going to be doing a question and answer period as soon as he gets done giving his talk. We've got some folks who will be taking questions. Raise your hand if you will be taking questions from the audience. We'll be passing them up here. And a couple of our awesome volunteers will be running that session. Thank you all for coming, ladies and gentlemen. Ezra Klein.
They really like you back there. Thanks to Matt for the kind introduction. Matt didn't mention it, but we used to write together back when blogging still is a word that none of y'all will know. But now it's huge. It's a future.
And I'm glad to be here in Montana. It's actually much more fun to do these in Montana than in DC. Number one, in DC, I still always wear jeans, but I seem much weirder for it. But I come to Montana, and I met Rob earlier, and he's in camo shorts, which makes me look incredibly well-dressed. And also, I get to have beer instead of coffee or water. But actually, they say that a glass of beer every day for men cuts heart risk. So if you're watching this on video later and you're not actually in the bar here and understand the context, there's actually a metaphor about the importance of prevention. So it's not just beer. Okay, so healthcare can be a bit of a dry subject. I once saw a talk by a guy named Mark Smith, who's out in California. He's CEO of the California Healthcare Foundation, and he started it, I thought, well. He said, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell it to you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. So I'm going to try to do that. And I'm going to try to tell you or convince you today of three things. The first thing is that healthcare, despite what some folks in the room will tell you, and some folks outside of it will tell you, is not a policy problem. It is not a policy problem. It is a problem of politics almost alone. Number two, that you are being told to focus on the wrong problems. That people are turning your attention to things that matter, but are not yet fundamental. And number three, that even if we succeed, even if we do everything we hope to do, we will not have solved our problem. So I'm basically here to depress you entirely today. And we'll see how that works out. Number one, politics. There is a tendency, and you see it in Washington, you see it if you go to places like the Kaiser Family Foundation or the Brookings Institute, and I end up there a lot, to look at healthcare as a problem that really smart people can solve. That the problem with the American healthcare system is there have been too few people who know how to use an Excel spreadsheet, too few people who know how to release a 38-page paper of principles, too few people who are willing to study it, release a plan, figure it out. This is not true. Healthcare, more than just about anything else I can think of, has a lot of smart folks in it because there are a lot of well-funded people willing to fund smart folks to think about it. So there are a lot of plans. There are a lot of people you can call up if you need an answer to a question. But somehow, with all that accumulated brainpower, it doesn't work. And it's kept not working for just about the entire 20th century. Harry Truman tried to do healthcare reform, failed. Johnson, FDR, by the way, also tried healthcare reform, decided it would doom Social Security if he gave it a shot. That was a fail. Johnson tried it, decided he'd go with Medicare and Medicaid instead. Carter tried it, but then got kicked out of office. Ted Kennedy went at him from the left. Nixon tried it. A lot of people think that was probably the best hope we've had in a while, but he didn't really go anywhere either. Clinton, of course, famously tried it. Then he lost 54 seats in the House of Representatives. And one thing I want to make clear about all that is each one of those plans was entirely different from the one that came before it. Just about every plan has been tried, right? Truman wanted national health care, something very close to single payer. Clinton had a fairly complicated, a hybrid of managed competition and managed choice, as it was called at the time. Nixon had an employer mandate system. Carter had something similar to that. George H.W. Bush, by the way, had a plan, looked very similar to some of the things we're actually seeing now. This is not, and I really want to repeat this to you, it is not about plans. We do not lose on health care because we do not have a good enough plan. Healthcare reform does not pass because the founders of the country wanted innocent children to get sick and die, and then for their parents to go bankrupt. When I do this, I tend to have a PowerPoint which would go up here, and the first slide is a picture of James Madison, and it just says jerk under it. Because the problem here is James Madison, and more to the point, the ability of the minority to resist the tyranny, which is to say universal health care, of the majority. In shorter, the filibuster. It's extremely hard to pass major legislative reform in this country, extremely hard, even when you win an election, even when you have a majority in Congress. So in 1994, the famous story, right? Clinton comes in, big moment of change, Democrats have 57 seats in the Senate, it all goes down in flames. And they say, Clinton really mismanaged that, and he did. But 2005, George W. Bush wins by, 3%? And he comes out and he says, I have a mandate and I intend to use it. And he tries to use it on Social Security privatization. And with a fair amount of help from your senator here, that gets killed. It's the beginning of the end for the Bush presidency. Now, people look at both of those as separate events, but they are not. They are not separate instances of very well-organized, well-funded minorities blocking reform. They are the system's ability to resist reform. That's why it was easy to do. And that is actually what you have to overcome, that a reformer has to overcome 10 or 12 veto points in the system. There are a lot of places to kill something going through the process. A vetoer only has to succeed at one. And so that ends up with a little bit of a problem. The other thing is that it makes a whole lot of sense for the minority to kill major legislative reform, right? If Barack Obama wants to get reelected in 2012, if Democrats want to pick up seats in 2010, what's the absolute best thing they can do, right? They can win. They can win legislatively and go to the country and they can say, we, for the first time in our country's history, have fixed health care. That because of what we've done here this year, every child in this country, every man and woman in this country will have health insurance. And if they do that, they will win. They will win seats, and everybody knows it. In 1994, Bill Kristol famously wrote a memo in which he said to the Republican Party, do not compromise, do not help Clinton, just kill it. Kill it, and if you don't kill it, if you don't destroy health care reform, they will win seats in the next election, and they'll reknit their connection with the middle class. And here's the thing, Bill Kristol gets a real bad rap for that, but he was right, and everybody knows it. He was absolutely correct, that if you're the minority, what you don't want to have happen is that the majority passes something important. The way to win in the next election is to see the majority fail. And so that's what they tried to do and tried to do. And it's not a problem unique to Republicans. It is the same for Democrats when they're in the minority. It is an inherent feature of the system. And when you talk about getting health care reform, what you're talking about is not how good is your health care plan. It is how do you overcome the system? How do you overwhelm the veto points? How do you get past the incentives for obstruction? And it's not easy. And like a real journalist, I don't have an answer for you, but I'm just going to leave that point there. Number two, and this jumps off of number one here. People are talking like this is a done deal. You probably all, how many people in this room, probably most of you, right, have heard about the furor over the public plan, right? Just raise your hand. All right, but right, so Democrats want to put in a government-run health insurer that will compete with private insurers. Republicans don't. This is sort of the real flashpoint of controversy right now. Howard Dean is getting involved. HCAN, our friends over here, they've done a lot of work on this. It's what everybody asks about. It's Senate hearings, and there's a tendency in these issues to become like an old couple arguing over the precise stereo features in a car they haven't figured out how to pay for yet. Healthcare reform, we now think, is going to cost $1.7 trillion over 10 years. $1.7 trillion. That's the numbers I'm hearing off of the Hill. 1.7 trillion. They're going to need to find that money, $170 billion a year for 10 years. And no one knows how they will do it. You cannot get an answer out of anyone. There's no mock-up, no plan that you've read, not Max Baucus's white paper, not Barack Obama's campaign plan, certainly not the Republican budget. No plan that you've read or been given access to says, here's how we will pay for this. And those numbers add up. It hasn't happened. And it's because nobody knows. You hear arguments right now over something called the employer tax exclusion. It's easy for your employer to offer you health insurance because it's tax-free. It's sort of like a 30% subsidy. It makes their dollar of compensation stretch farther for you. That's all good. It should be dismantled, probably. It's regressive. It helps richer people more than helps poorer people. It distorts the system. It means that you don't know how much is actually being paid on your behalf. It means that you don't know that there are wage increases you're not getting and that you could be getting if you were making different healthcare decisions. It might be capped. People are saying that, but then there's a lot of argument. Maybe it won't be capped. A lot of unions don't want it capped. Various advocacy groups have come out against it. But if you don't do that, that's where all the money is. Then they had an idea. Barack Obama had what I thought was a good idea. He said, what we should do to get $314 billion is we should make it so rich people, people making over $250,000, can deduct a little bit less on their taxes, a little bit less. Instead of getting 35% off of what are called itemized deductions, they get 28%. Middle income folks, y'all, you get 15%. That got riddled with bullets in the US Senate. I mean, it just got torn apart. And so when they released the Democratic budget in the Senate, that's deleted. It got erased. So, but nobody said, we're not going to do that, but here's where the $300 billion is going to come from. Just got erased. So what I really want to try and impress into you when you all are doing advocacy on this, when you all are thinking about this, that until somebody figures out how to pay for the goddamn thing, there's no healthcare reform. What we have right now is a lot of people saying, we're going to do this. What we don't have is anybody saying, here's how we're going to pay for it. And if you can't pay for it, you can't do it. You could do, I'm not saying you should, but you could do healthcare reform without a public option. You can't do it without money to pay. You just can't. And that sort of scares me. But it does get to a dynamic that we're just beginning to see manifest, which is that the majority always looks really strong, as it does now, until there's a bill on the table. Right? Right now you have an interesting sort of situation in which Democrats are saying, what we should do is reform our absurdly unjust, morally abhorrent, unbelievably expensive healthcare system. And some Republicans are saying, God, you know, I don't think that's a good idea. And that doesn't look good. People don't like it. People don't like to be for the status quo. Status quo is bad. Everyone knows it. So that's been real hard on them. And you can see it. They're in disarray. There's a Politico story. Republicans in disarray on healthcare. Okay. The problem comes that, and this was true in 1994 too, it should be said, when you put a bill on the table. And then they say, this one provision, there's one piece here. And they go to the people and they say, that's going to mean you can't get all the care you want, won't it? It'll mean that some bureaucrat can decide if this treatment makes sense. I mean, now that bureaucrat would probably be your doctor, be deciding based on evidence on whether or not the treatment makes sense, but they'll say it. Or they'll say, this will raise your taxes, small business. Or they'll say, your taxes, rich people. They probably will raise their taxes. And piece by piece, they'll begin to attack it. They will turn interest groups. They will get everybody upset about one part. And enough people be upset about a part that they will begin to attack the whole. That's how it goes every time. Bush looked strong on Social Security privatization, remember when that was going to happen? And then he started talking about what it would mean. Clinton, they said it was an inevitability. Bob Dole said, we're going to do this year. Then there was a bill on the table. So don't get complacent. Don't think you're done. Don't think that it's time to sort of argue about the public plan or argue. This isn't anywhere yet. This is a lot of people saying popular things. And some of the things they're going to have to say at the end of the day are going to be unpopular. And if they can't sustain that, if they can't survive that, and remember, they don't really need to fail. They just need to fail with 40 of 60 senators. That's all they need to fail with, 40 of 60. And if they can't sustain that, then there'll be no healthcare reform. So I would be sort of careful about where we are in the process. I don't think we're as far as people think we are. And I think that there are sort of fundamental things where there's not yet consensus. And I'm not saying there needs to be, but there needs to be a recognition of the importance. The third thing is that imagine it all goes great. Imagine it works. Imagine we get exactly the plan that Max Baucus, I think, admirably laid out in his white paper. And that's a pretty good plan. Considering what people are talking about, it's about the maximum of what we're likely to see. There's some details not filled in, but it's about as far as people are likely to go. It's a plan that Ted Kennedy, sort of tacitly gave his support to. It's a plan that's right there in the center of the Democratic consensus. That won't solve a lot of the healthcare problems. In particular, it won't solve the cost problem. And the problem with healthcare is cost, right? If healthcare were $2, 50 million people wouldn't be uninsured. The fact that it's 14,000 means some uninsured folks. And you're having an interesting thing right now where folks are playing a bit of bait and switch on cost. They're saying things like, well, let me put it this way. The fundamental thing that's going to have to happen here is people are going to have to make less money. Healthcare system's around $2 trillion. We think about 15% to 30% of that is spending that doesn't need to be there. It's spending that doesn't help anybody. But every dollar of waste, this is a great thing Newt Gingrich once said. He said, one man's waste is another man's profit. Every dollar of waste is somebody's profit. And what they're trying to do in healthcare right now, and I don't blame them, I think it's probably the right political strategy, but it is what they're doing, is trying to do healthcare reform without really hurting anybody's profit. They want to do healthcare reform without enemies, because it's so hard, even so. It's so hard to do it, even if you don't really have enemies, even if nobody really is threatened. That if you really begin to threaten people, I don't mean just on the margins, I mean really threaten them, which is what we're going to end up needing if we're going to afford this in the long run, then you lose. So they're doing something different. They're trying to get the system together, get everybody in, and make it so we have to make decisions as a people. They're trying to make it so what ends up happening is that instead of our passive version of cost control that we have now, where every year 2 million people become uninsured just because, but it's nobody's fault, so nobody gets blamed, that instead we have to make a decision. Do you throw 2 million people off the rolls through an act of Congress? Does Congress sign a law saying there will be more uninsured people in this country? Or do you say to the pharmaceutical industry, you're going to make less money this year? Or to the medical device industry, you're going to make less money this year? As long as they don't have to do that, they don't do it. If one of these bills passes, they will. But the bill itself will not solve the problem. It won't get costs down. And within a couple of years, we'll be in essentially the same problem where, this is a lot of goddamn money. And we don't have that much money. And it squeezes out other things like early childhood education or building a bridge. And they're going to need to figure it out. We're in a better place to figure that out if the system is universal, if it's integrated, if there's a sort of this government-run market over here where you can begin to do some cost controls. It's not run through employers. But that's the first step. It isn't the last. Which is, oddly, puts me in a sort of optimistic place, right? I think my read of the political history of these reforms is that they don't really go anywhere when you try to do too much. That the history is littered with the bodies of the very ambitious. And that what we're trying to do here is make things better. Not perfect, it won't solve it, but better. And if we can do that, then we can wake up one morning after we've signed that bill and after 50 million more people have health insurance and after nobody who goes to the doctor worries about medical bankruptcy, and then we can look at the price tag and we can look at our budget and then we can say, all right, now it's time to make that a little bit better. And you do that enough times, and eventually things are pretty good. So I think there's a real opportunity for that. But what I very much want to convince you of is it's not a sure thing. We're not going for perfection, but even better isn't a sure thing. And so it's going to take a lot more work on the part of all you fine folks for it to happen. And with that, we can go to Q&A. Are you guys still taking questions, by the way?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so these people over here, they're taking questions, and you should ask them questions, and they will ask me. and I will try to answer. All right. Oh, I got a reserve chair. Great.
So thank you so much, Ezra. We're really happy to have you here. And thanks, everybody, for coming. And I'm going to introduce our questionnaires, I should call them. My name is Molly Moody, and I'm with Montanans for Healthcare and our great coalition partners and Healthcare for America Now. So Andy Shirtlift and Christine DeCenso will be taking the questions and presenting them to Ezra. They're both volunteers for Generation H, which is an all-volunteer committee working on healthcare reform with Forward Montana. Andy is in charge of volunteer recruitment. He's a senior student at U of M in political science, and he is currently employed as a waiter without healthcare. Go figure. And Christine DeCenso to my right, she is also with Generation H on the events team, and she's an administrative assistant for an after-school nonprofit with very pricey insurance. So I'll turn it over to them. Thanks.
This is exciting. I'm going to get to take questions from genuine archetypes. I never get to do that.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Ezra. That was a great talk. Thank you.
I'm going to move out a little here because I'm crowding you.
So what can be done to change the healthcare system to make it more accessible to GLBT individuals and partners?
I assume if I can, I'm not totally sure I get that question, but I assume the issue here is that currently a lot of employers don't offer spousal benefits for GLBT partners. Number one, we could get it away from employers, right? So instead of hoping that you can get coverage through the person you love, you just get some coverage, that it is part of a defined right in the richest society in the world that you don't go without health care, you don't depend on a widget maker's favor for health care, that you just have some health care. So I think that would be the optimal way to solve that problem, and it should just be, it shouldn't be about GLBT, it should just be everyone should have health care. But if you don't get there, then I think the question is one more of domestic, probably I think it's a state law issue. I think that would actually have to do with ERISA. So you'd probably have to lobby state governments to extend that law. And my understanding is a number of them have, but I wouldn't know if that's happened here or how many. So I wish you luck.
All right, next question. What steps to healthcare reform should we expect to see first from Washington?
You know, I think folks are on the Big Bang Theory right now, that insofar as we can do it, there aren't going to be steps. There will be healthcare reform. You're not going to do cost first and access later, access first and cost later. You're just going to pass the bill. And that there's a theory behind that, which is that it's easy to be for against parts. It's harder to be against the whole. But I don't think that the way people are conceiving of it, it is a sequenced process. I think that they're really trying to take one bite at the apple. And if they can pass it, they can pass it. And if they can't, then probably people think about fallback positions. The ones I hear pretty commonly are coverage for all children. The ones I hear sometimes are extending Medicare down to 55 rather than 65. But those really are fallback positions. I think that people really want not a step towards healthcare reform, but the thing that we tend to think of as healthcare reform, which is something near to universal access, something including delivery reform, and a number of measures that improve quality and cost. So, and wish them luck with it. It's a big lift.
Please discuss preventative health care and alternative health care.
Ooh. Now, if only, I'm a wonk. I get excited about things like this. And I just finished a 4,000-word article for the upcoming American Prospect, fine magazine, you should all subscribe, entitled, Why Healthcare Reform Won't Make You Healthier. And it won't, is the answer. Healthcare reform is a matter of economic security primarily. Insurance is good for those who don't have it. It'll make a marginal benefit in their lives, not as much as you might think. What it'll do is it'll make them not medically bankrupt, which is a big deal. It will also make the country not bankrupt, which is a big deal as well. If you do nothing about healthcare, then government spending on healthcare, just government spending, not private spending, is 37% of GDP by 2050, which is sort of like saying you're dead. So you need to do something about it for economic reasons. But healthcare doesn't fundamentally happen in a doctor's office or at a hospital. It's good not to bleed on your floor, but it's better not to get sick. Researchers have estimates on this sort of thing, and they think 10 to 15% of what they call amenable mortality, which is dying that you shouldn't be doing, is healthcare related, could be improved by better access to health services. The rest of it is behavior, it's environment, it's genes, it's nutrition. But the problem is, and you guys know this well because he's your senator, healthcare goes through the Senate Finance Committee, right? And that's actually you should really take that seriously. It is a finance issue. What we're talking about is healthcare system financing reform. Nutrition is a bigger deal for things like preventive healthcare, but that goes through the Agriculture Committee. Early childhood education is a big deal. That also goes through another committee. Crime is a big deal. People don't go outside if they're not safe, and then they don't move, and then they get obese, and they get type 2 diabetes. That goes through judiciary. There will be some efforts on preventive healthcare, but we really don't have a conversation about keeping people healthier, in part because there's no money in it, right? You hear a lot about preventing or ensuring that people with diabetes can access care. You don't hear a lot about keeping people from getting diabetes, and the reason you don't hear it is that doesn't make anybody any money. And that's not an attack on anyone, just it's how things work. But it creates a sort of problem in the long run. In the long run, one of three things is going to happen in healthcare. We will have less expensive technology. We will stop buying it. We will give fewer people access to expensive technology, so we use less of it. Or we will need less expensive technology because we won't be as sick. And I would prefer to go the third one. The third one is a better route. It'd be better if we were all healthier. But there is a metaphor I use in the piece is that we have this healthcare system because we thought it would make us healthier, and it does. It was important. But now it's sort of, that's all we think about. It obsesses us. And we're a little bit like folks who got this great car. I use a lot of car metaphors, I just realized. I don't even like driving. We got this great car, but we got so obsessed with it that we forgot where we were trying to drive. And there's a way in which you become very focused on the healthcare system and stop thinking all that much about health. And that's a real problem. And it's a bigger one than I can get into today, but it's a real problem. But I promise you'll be entirely and comprehensively answered in the June issue of the American Prospect. And you'll really love it. It's like hearing me for 40 minutes or something.
Speaking of finance, that's why we're writing those letters to our senators right now, because it is very important, like Ezra mentioned.
So I have a Max Baucus profile on that table. Like my forthcoming article, it's incisive and comprehensive and really a glittering read.
Ezra, what role do you see for both public and private insurance in the short and long term?
You guys ask very vague or very broad questions. I think they will exist. The question of the precise mix, I think, is more complicated. Medicare is going to become a little bit more public than it is now. The private plans of Medicare are about to get squeezed, as they should be. They are charging 120% more to insure individuals than Medicare is. So we're going to stop paying that. That's one of the ways we're going to finance healthcare reform. On the other side, the big question is, will we have a public plan? I don't know. It's a really big question, and if we do get financing together, people should really get worried about that and get active on that, and they should get active on it now, for that matter. It's a good idea to have a private plan. In part, you hear a lot about the private plan acting like Medicare, setting payment rates, which is all fine. It should do that. It won't. You're not going to get that through the Senate. Oh, I'm sorry, a public plan. Right, that's what I'm talking about. A public plan. But let's say you have a public plan that just acts as a competitor, right? It doesn't have any special legislative powers. It doesn't have any government subsidy. It just does what it does. It has a couple advantages. One is administrative. It'll cost less because they're not like a lot of people sitting there trying to figure out how to not give you health care. And then you don't have to pay those people. That's sort of cool. But the other one is that we're sort of relying a lot on insurer good behavior here. We're going to have a new market, and we're going to tell insurers, bid. Give us your bid. Give us your bid to cover people in this market. And insurers aren't stupid. They're going to probably give us a bid that's 10% or 20% higher than the real bid you'd need. There's a lot of information out there. They know what they're doing. If you have an independent actor, like a public plan, it may be that no one ever signs up for it. But everyone else in the market knows that they can't screw around. Because if they do, then that plan gets a competitive advantage, and then they begin losing because people can save money going to the public plan. And that isn't the government helping it out. That's sheer competition. It is simple competition. And so all those folks out there saying it's an unlevel playing field, it's an unlevel playing field now, people. Insurers have a lot more information than you do. And this will help you get some more information. All playing fields are unlevel. It's capitalism. The way competition works is people win because they're better. And what everybody tries to do all the time is make the playing field unlevel in their favor. The public plan levels it a little bit towards the consumer. And I think it's a good idea for that reason. But whether it'll survive, I don't know. Your senator has a lot to say on that. And he's probably the guy, he'd probably be worth talking to on the issue.
We've heard a lot about electronic medical records, and the short-term costs for those are very high. How much evidence is there for long-term cost savings?
A lot of evidence, but more to the point, I'd say not a lot of evidence in the medical literature. Say you go into a bank. Say I like to open a deposit, and a sort of an aging teller grabbed a huge book off of a back shelf and sort of laboriously lifted it open and smacked down and said, all right, Klein, K, here'd be the page you'd be on. You would run out of that bank. You would think they were crazy people. I mean, the idea that I walk into my doctor's office and they put my crucial medical history in a manila folder. We've reached a point of true absurdity. I write a blog. I don't even trust my words to paper. And I'm just talking some bullshit. These are my medical records. So I don't think one really, I think the question of upfront costs is a real issue. And you're going to need subsidies. You're going to need to help people out with that. Because one thing that is true, right? If a doctor pays $52,000 to put electronic medical records program in his practice, he doesn't make that money back, right? You make it back, or the insurer makes it back, but not him. You don't pay him more because of his medical records. You're paying him enough. So that's going to need to come from elsewhere. One of the problems in healthcare is that the incentives are often different from the rewards. But you do need them, and they would help. And also, it's not just about money. Fewer people will die. And we have very good evidence on that from the VA health system, but fewer people will die. It is really astonishing how many people die because your doctor has crappy handwriting. I mean, really astonishing. We're not talking 4 people. We're talking thousands and thousands of people who get prescribed a drug and then are given the wrong drug because Prilosec looks like Provosec. And that interferes with something else they're taking or activates an allergy, and that's that. So we really need to do this. And I mean, it sort of is funny, and at a point all you can do is laugh, but seriously, we don't use computers in healthcare.
It is kind of absurd, isn't it? Invest in English classes. So you've written about Senator Max Baucus, and you've talked about him here tonight. Now, he'll be important in the reform process. Can you talk about about Max and his role in this reform?
Sure. Max, Senator Baucus, rather, his people are everywhere, is, so I'm told, I'm in Montana. He is the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and that is the relevant committee for healthcare. It is not, as unfortunately for some people on other committees, as they would have it. The other relevant committee is a committee called Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, run by Kennedy. They have a role. They're not central. They're not central. Finance is central because finance controls all the money. And as we've talked about a bit here, if you don't have money, you don't have healthcare. So Senator Baucus is going to be essentially the key player. He's also a pretty serious coalition builder. So he's the guy who can get people like Evan Bayh and Blanche Lincoln on the bill. He's the guy who knows how to reach out to them. It should be said that a lot of people I know, a lot of people in health reform were deeply skeptical of your senator. And there are reasons to be. He's had a number of votes that give liberals, and I think even Democrats generally, a fair amount of heartburn. I mean, you all remember he stood behind Bush when he signed the 2001 tax cut. You know, he was sort of a key player in getting Medicare Part D passed, which you can argue sort of back and forth on the merits of, but he didn't act in a way the Democratic caucus particularly approved of. But people are unanimous right now. The folks who watch this, who observe this, who talk to me in their admiration for how hard he is working on it. He's really done everything he can do at this point and is continuing to do so. Now, I think people can argue his ideology on it, but I think he's taking the seriousness of his role, the centrality of his role, as soberly as one could. And I think a couple months ago, you would have looked at healthcare and said, we're really in bad shape. Ted Kennedy has terminal brain cancer. Tom Daschle has crappy tax returns. And so the two key guys were out. That's not how you want to start something like this, but people stepped up, and I think the two people you really have to give credit to are Peter Orszag, who is the director of the Office of Management and Budget and has really worked hard on that, and really stepped into the void left by Tom Daschle, and Baucus, who has really become a key player on this. And you know, his health aide Liz Fowler is probably the key wonk on this issue at this point. So he's going to be very, very central, and I think there's no doubt he wants to do it. We'll see how much is in his power, and I think there's a question of where, when it comes down to the line, where does Senator Baucus think the right place to draw your compromise line is? And I think people are still cautious on that. I don't think a lot of liberals are certain he would draw it where they would draw it. But that'll be the thing to watch. But for now, in this sort of interim run-up period, he's doing, I think, everything that one could possibly ask of him.
Do you think it's likely that many social programs will have to be cut to make funding available for universal health care?
No. They're not going to cut social programs for it. I don't see any chance of it. But they should really tax rich people more. I really can't stress how important that is. At some point, you can't do things if you're not willing to tax anybody, and they've sworn they won't tax the middle class. You can't do this if you're not going to tax some rich people. Money comes from somewhere. Also, just one point. We're really good at paying things when we decide we want to pay for them. Iraq was never on the budget. I mean, people don't realize this, but it was never built into a budget. They did these things called emergency appropriations, emergency supplementals. So it's never even on a budget. Nobody said, God, how will we pay for this war we don't need to fight and then don't need to continue funding and then shouldn't do and then should probably leave from? They just did it month after month, and it cost more than healthcare reform and quicker. And we just sit around and be like, God, how are we going to pay for this? And, well, okay, you can tax rich people, you can take it off budget, but this idea that we can't pay for it is crap. We do the things we want to do. We are literally the richest country in the history of the world. We can pay for healthcare reform. We just need to do it. And the problem is that the Senate hears from a lot of rich people, and that tends to throw a kink into the works. But it is a kink of politics and not policy. I can't emphasize that enough. The blockages here are politics and not policy. They are questions of political power, and there are questions of political incentives, but they're literally in no sector questions that we don't have policy answers to. There are ways to pay for it. The question is if you can get people to vote for them.
Since most Americans have coverage with which they're happy, how do you convince the middle class that they'll be better off?
That's a good question. This is a hard issue, right? And it's what we call the paradox, what I and a couple people I know call the paradox of health reform. There really aren't that many people saying things like that. Looking at polls, 80-some% of people say healthcare either needs to be fundamentally rebuilt or completely rebuilt. So the mandate for change is significant. Same polls, 80-some% of people say, I like what I have. I approve, I am satisfied with my private sector healthcare insurance. They do not. I mean, people try to convince you otherwise, but there's just no evidence that people hate what they have. The fundamental reality of healthcare reform for the insured, is that they are afraid of losing what they have. They're afraid of losing their private sector coverage. This, by the way, was a big problem for Bill Clinton because he had a healthcare plan that was still private, by the way, but changed your private sector coverage. Said, all right, you're worried about losing what you have, which is what was going on in 1993. Well, here's what I'm going to do. Make you a deal. I'll take it away from you. And then we're going to build this thing you've never seen or heard of before, and then we'll do that. That doesn't work. So the big question, and you hear this mantra repeated all of the time, if you like what you have, you keep it. And they say that all the time, and that's bad policy, by the way. What you have, y'all are fucking up the healthcare system. It's bad policy. It's through your employers, generally speaking. It's too expensive. It doesn't make any sense. You don't know what's in it. It's bad policy. It is not how we would do it. But healthcare is very personal. It's not a puzzle. It's something people rely on. It's something people feel safer because they have. There are more people in this country currently worried about losing their healthcare than worried about terrorism. That's probably correct. Not that many people die from terrorism. A lot of people lose their healthcare. But it's really indicative of what a personal issue this is. It really hits home. And so you can't move people too quick on it. You can't move people quick. You can ask them to walk up to the ledge. And so what you generally have is a policy compromise. And you say, we're not going to take what you have. We're going to keep it. We're going to let you have it. We're going to build this other thing over here, this other market, where there'll also be private insurers and maybe a public insurer, and where we're going to make sure nobody can discriminate against you, and we're going to make sure that it's better regulated, and we're going to try to make it cheaper. And over time, if you feel comfortable with it, come on over. But only if you want to. But it is a healthcare system based on choice. It's based on the choice to keep what you have, and the choice to move over, and then the choice to choose what you get when you move over. That, again, is not good policy, but it is good politics. People want to keep what they have. They're very serious about that, and it's a very human and a very understandable desire. And it's hard to screw with it. And I think most politicians are very, very, very loath to try.
Speaking of politicians being loath to try, you mentioned the procedural barriers to reform in Congress. Can you talk about the so-called nuclear option we hear about to make cloture votes?
I'm so excited I get to talk about reconciliation process. I love talking about reconciliation process. Okay, reconciliation process began as a way to bring two budget bills together. Congress used to do two budget bills a year, one at the beginning, one at the end. They were different. Things changed. But you can't get anything through the Senate. You didn't want to not have a budget. So they created a way to bypass a filibuster. Essentially, if you invoke reconciliation, budget reconciliation, there's only like 20 hours of debate and 50 votes, not 60, and you can't touch it. You can't filibuster it. Then somebody realized in the rules of reconciliation, it doesn't need to be a budget. You can pass anything. So they did that for a while and passed some things through reconciliation. And then Senator Robert Byrd, Jr., although Senator Robert Byrd Jr. is now around 17,009 years old. But Senator Robert Byrd Jr. created what he called the Byrd Rule, which restricted the budget reconciliation process to things that were directly related to budgetary spending. Things were directly related to budgetary spending. And I can't repeat that enough. Directly related to budgetary spending. In the Byrd Rule, and here's the problem. Let's say you can get, so there are all these tests in the Byrd Rule for whether something qualifies for reconciliation. And the main ones that are hard here is that every provision, and provision is an undefined word, needs to not be, and this is also undefined, merely incidental to the budget, to spending. Now, nobody knows what provision means. Sometimes it can mean literally words inside of one sentence. And nobody knows what merely incidental means. Let's say I want to regulate insurers and not let them say, you can't get health care because you were sick one time. And that will change the amount of subsidies that we have to give, because it'll change the price of insurance a little bit. And is that merely incidental? Well, nobody knows. Probably not, but nobody knows. So here's a trade-off in budget reconciliation. It's like deciding healthcare reform on penalty kicks. You can get it through, probably. You get 50 votes. The question is, we don't know what comes through. Everything gets challenged, and the Senate parliamentarian, whose name even I don't know, decides. He decides if this is germane on a sentence-by-sentence level. And so you could end up, as a Democratic staffer explained to me, and a liberal Democratic staffer, because he had it happen to him in a bill for infant vaccination. You could end up in a situation where you have said, we're going to give $30 billion to the Awesome Commission for awesome test results, and then we will spend it on awesome things. And they can delete everything in that sentence but $30 billion. So now you're giving $30 billion to a commission that hasn't been created or defined. And there's just $30 billion somewhere. And nobody knows what to do with it, and it's in legal limbo. And It's not a good way to do it. People, I think, try to convince you, and it happens, that we should do it this way, that it would be a great idea, that it would really make everything easier. It wouldn't. You'd come out with a bill that really nobody knows what it'll look like. But that's as big a problem for Republicans as Democrats. And so budget reconciliation is sort of like bringing a really big guy to a party and having him just sort of stand behind you and tap his foot all night. It's a way of saying to those who would obstruct the process that, okay, we can do it the easy way or the hard way. Right. And reconciliation is the hard way. It's hard on everybody. But it's another option. And they're keeping it on the table. And props to them for that. Baucus hasn't taken it off. Obama hasn't taken it off. Even Ken Conrad, the chair of the budget committee who would sort of control that, he hasn't taken it off. So it sort of sits there as a threat. And they'll use it if they decide they need to use it. But it isn't anybody's first choice, and some people suggest that that's because they're all sort of weak-kneed wimps, and that's not it. It's not your first choice because it shouldn't be. You could end up in budget reconciliation, and you might exit that process, and you haven't reformed insurance at all, because that's non-budgetary. But you have increased subsidies, which is good. But it's not, full healthcare reform probably can't come through that. Also, if you do that, no Republican will ever vote on anything Obama does ever again. That's not obviously different from how things have been, but it's potentially worth thinking about.
Single payer without charging employers will make the corporate world a powerful ally. Why is no one looking at the single payer without charging the corporate world?
No, it won't. I mean, I don't know another way to say this, and I think, I wish we could talk more about this, and I really would invite whoever asked the question to stand up and respond, so we can talk a bit more about it. I'll give a quick answer, and then, because I want to go back and forth, and we should talk about single payer, and we haven't done it enough here. Intellectually, I am for single payer. It is a good idea. Not single payer the way Canada or Britain do it, but France has something. It's a sort of multi-payer system. It's a good system. We can talk about it. If employers wanted single payer, they would say that, and we would have it. And I can't put it more simply than that. It's a mistake people make on all sides of the debate to try to logic out the actions of the players, what they would do in another world, but they're all rational players. If employers are by far the most powerful interest group in the world, they're much more powerful than insurers, than pharma, than device, than anyone. If they had come out, if the Business Roundtable and the NFIB had come out and said, single payer for everyone, we would have it. Famously, in 1994, the NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Business, who are, villains is the word I'm looking for, villains, kicked the hell out of your senator and flipped him. Now, I guess it's probably arguable if they flipped him, but they sure to roll in it, and David Broder's book has a lot on this, and they sort of have them bragging about how they got him to change his vote on a pretty important procedural matter. They do not want it, and one interesting thing that's related to that question is why don't they want out, right? So forget single payer for 1 second. There's this bill called the Wyden-Bennett bill that would get them out, but it would still be a private system. And they haven't embraced it like people thought they would, and why? Okay. The best answer I've gotten is that businessmen are sort of fundamentally conservative, and they do not trust the government. And here's what you can do right now if healthcare costs get too high, right? You can say, I'm not paying. And then nobody has healthcare, but you're not paying it. But if the government says, I'm going to tax you 9%, you can't say I'm not paying. You don't have control. And businessmen like to have control. And it's not a good form of control, and it doesn't help them, it makes it worse on them. They would be better off under single payer. But they're not your allies, and not on single payer. And even though it would seem to make a certain amount of logical sense for them to be there, the important evidence here is that they're not. But I want to give you an opportunity to respond.
I just want to say, in 1992, even George H.W. Bush, as you said, had a plan. And why would the right wing be supporting this? And it's because it's welfare to corporations, what the right wing likes.
Supporting what?
Supporting national health care, supporting a single payer plan, which they weren't necessarily supporting. But the idea was to take these costs that the corporate world is paying for and spell off on the government. And so, what in 1994 we were talking about why NFIB was against it was by that time the Hillary Clinton plan said we're going to fund this with payroll tax, which meant that the corporate world was going to be paying for it anyway. So that threw off that aspect of support. If we were to change it, change the plan and say, okay, we want the government to pay for it, we don't want the corporate world to pay for it. Because I can imagine ads from General Motors saying this car brought to you because cheaper because we have national health care. Why,
Sure.
if we were very clear about that, why wouldn't that happen?
So the question he's asking for people who can't hear is, what if we said, here's the deal, employers. You don't pay a cent, not a penny. The government pays. You're out. You don't pay 1 penny. Why wouldn't they be for it? And the answer is that government money comes from somewhere, right? And if you're going to take the employer role, and employers currently pay the majority of healthcare costs in the private sector, the majority, you're saying that the entirety of their role, all that money, is going to be refashioned into a straight tax on individuals. From a point of view of economic efficiency, I think that's probably a better idea. It is death to a politician to say, I'm going to raise your taxes by, what would it be, like 22%? I mean, I don't have the number on me, and I'm not saying it it would literally be something like that. It would be incredibly expensive. I mean, an incredible amount of compensation goes into healthcare, and it's an incredibly expensive thing. So you'd be dealing with, not in a sort of distorted talking points way, the largest tax increase by far of all time. And no one would vote for it. Not your senator here, not Evan Bayh, not Barbara Boxer, my senator from California. The money would have to come from somewhere. If you're moving everything out of employers and the moment, and it wouldn't take more than a moment for somebody to say, here is your taxes before Obama's initiative, and here is them after. That's the end.
But nobody's asking where TARP money's come from. And nobody says, well, what happens when the Defense Department goes forward?
Well, TARP, yeah, you're right. But TARP money is a one-time. I mean, so I don't want to go too far through this, but the money eventually does come from somewhere. The Tea Parties are right about that. And that money right now is in national debt. And that's a lot of debt. And taxes are going to go up in your future because it does have to be paid back someday. It is true that they're being irresponsible on some level. I mean, you don't want to raise taxes right now for TARP. You don't want the financial system to seize up and us all to be living in a sort of Lord of the Flies dystopia. But healthcare is that money every year, and it's much more money than went to TARP. $700 billion, or $350 billion a year in TARP, actually, because it's 700 over 2 years. Healthcare is $2 trillion a year, $2 trillion. So we're dealing with much, much, much bigger sums, and they don't erase after 2 years. They just keep on every year. So I'm not arguing with the theory of what you're saying. If there's a way to take it from employers, but at the end of the day, the public would be no happier with that level of tax rise. So I think that's where there's no free lunch in healthcare. It's same for White and Bennett, by the way. It doesn't matter if you did it on one side or the other, private or public. People are going to have to pay, and nobody wants to pay.
Well, I think that about does it for the Q&A. I think our time is up. Let's give Ezra Klein a round of applause. Thank you, Ezra. You did great. Well, thank you everybody for coming. First off, I'd like to thank, once again, Ezra, thank you so much for coming. I'd like to thank our friends at SEIU, the Service Employee International Union. Thank you very much for all your help today. Let's give a round of applause. And our friend Molly Moody with Healthcare for America Now, HCAN. Thank you, Molly. I'd also like to thank the National Healthcare Reform Coalition. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you. The Blue Mountain Clinic, and I'd like to thank all of you guys for coming on down. We really appreciate this.
So I'm going to interrupt you. I haven't heard of Forward Montana.
Oh, hey, Forward Montana!
But it's Forward Montana that brought me out, and people should all, I don't know what it is they tell you to do, but you should do it.